try it.
So it is 7 o'clock and I see Elaine is on and Sabrina. So I'm going to turn it over to both of you if you like, or if you would like to wait for a few more minutes, that's up to you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think we'll wait a couple more minutes because there seem to be people coming in very quickly right now. And I think that it's fine to just wait briefly.
Yes.
You okay with
I
that,
see we
Sabrina?
have, I think that's a good plan. We have 104 attendees right now. So it grows every moment, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
We have a total of 104 attendees. We have a couple questions already that I can answer. One is whether this is a one-way Zoom and that we can see the presentation, but not each other. And yes, we did set it to speaker view, so you'll be able to see whoever is speaking. And then someone else suggests we all celebrate Bobby Burns Day, which of course. So here's that. Thank you very much. And we are up to now 113.
I think, Sarah, we will wait till 7:05 and then we will go. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I was going to say it's great to see you, but I can't see you. So I'm just so happy that you're joining us. I'd like to open our evening with our land acknowledgement. Though we are joining this gathering from different places, we take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that Women's Institute work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across Ontario. Indigenous peoples have been the stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters since time immemorial. They continue to maintain this responsibility to ensure their health and integrity for generations to come. With respect for the treaties that were made on these territories and acknowledgement of the harms and mistakes of the past, we dedicate ourselves to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Ontario-wide Women's Institute event. My name is Elaine Tully, and I'm president of the Women Inspiring Women branch here in Paris. About 4 years ago, I met Sabrina Sawyer when our branch hosted an all candidates event in advance of the last provincial election. Sabrina ran as the NDP candidate in our Brant riding. Immediately upon our initial conversation, I knew I wanted to hear more from this intelligent, caring woman. And when I wanted to do more about reconciliation with our Indigenous neighbors, she was my first thought. As you will have read in Sabrina's bio, she's a tireless worker in the education field, as well as equity, social justice, and women's services. I'll leave it to Sabrina to tell you more about herself and her work. Welcome, Sabrina.
Thank you much, Elaine. And I'm just going to get the technology going here. Excellent. Can everyone see the slideshow? Elaine, I can see you. Can you let me know if you can see the slideshow? Perfect, thank you. My little green light around the screen isn't showing up the way it usually is, so I just wanted to check. So Anin Ginewea Segoseuguego, and I'm seeing people dropping in the chat where people are coming from already, and that would be amazing if you can continue just to let me know where everyone is coming from. I like to know how far we are reaching one another, and there's such a power in the collective of women. So I like to know how powerful we are being this evening as we're gathering together. So feel free to drop it in the chat, whether you know your traditional territory that you're on, your treaty territory, or just let me know what part of the province or Canada. I see we had Nova Scotia there, where you're joining from. That would be fantastic. And I'm going to introduce myself. Sabrina Sawyer Anishinaabe and Anishinaabe Kwe Endau, Mnjikaning First Nation Rama, Ontario and Donjaba, Wabajeshki and Dodum. So I've introduced myself into in my language of Ojibwe as an Anishinaabe woman, and saying that brings roles and responsibilities. I've let you know where my home community is, which is Rama, Ontario, also known as Mnjikaning First Nation. We are the people of the fish weirs, and some very sophisticated ways of fishing and trapping in the waters in a historical way, and incredible stories around that. If you ever get a chance to go to Rama and see the weirs, they are still there. And I also let you know my clan. And you can see on the screen, it says Martin Clan. And I introduced that as Wabajeshki and Dodum. And if you don't know what a Martin is, this is it. And a part of me growing up as an Indigenous woman was coming into knowing who I was. And part of that was understanding how this particular creature represented my roles and responsibilities coming into this world. And it was quite challenging for myself. A lot of people that I knew as an adult, as I was growing into this responsibility, they were Eagle Clan, they were Bear Clan, they were Fish Clan. I loved the word Gigon, which is the Ojibwe word for fish. And I had a really hard time reconciling that this little rodent was who I was supposed to live up to be. And as I grew to understand the responsibilities and the role of the Martin within our clan system, it slowly began to make sense. But when we look at them at face value, they seem very small, very sneaky, but they are nimble. They are nimble, which I grew as I developed skills in ultimate Frisbee. I developed that nimbleness. But I also learned that they were warriors within our connected communities, and they were the strategists. And it wouldn't be until I grew into more of my adulthood and my professional roles and my political aspirations that I began to understand how critical that those understandings and those teachings would become. And we'll start to see how all of that unfolds as I start to talk about my perspective as living Indigenous from a women's perspective, how that comes to be. And I love that we started in a good way talking about the land acknowledgement and acknowledging the land upon which we're all doing this work. For myself, I'm in Brantford, Ontario, so it's in southwestern Ontario. And specifically here, if we're talking about treaties and traditional lands, it's traditional lands to both the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory and Mississaugas of the Credit. And going back as far as one of the very first wampum agreements, the two-row wampum, the Gaswentha, covers that area as well. And then later would come the dish with one spoon, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. And then later when we get into numbered treaties and treaties, we look at between the Lakes Treaty, which now the particular land that I am on now falls within the Haldimand Tract. And so there's a great deal of history that comes with the area with which I sit, work, live, play, and work within community. And that's where I came to understand a lot of the teachings as well as an adult about living Indigenous and living in this particular area, which is predominantly Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, predominantly Haudenosaunee with the large Six Nations of the Grand River Territory as a neighbor to us. So I mentioned this particular wampum, and when we're talking about this evening living Indigenous, myself, this particular wampum and the teachings that I have taken the time to dive deeper into and come to understand and incorporate much of my being is through a gentleman that's here, historian, knowledge keeper, Rick Hill. So I just want to give credit to where much of those teachings come from. And he is a Haudenosaunee person from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. When we're looking at this wampum, it really lays out what our paths were intended to be. And the two purple rows that you see there represent two nations coming together and trying to find a way how they were going to travel down the river of life together peacefully. And one particular purple row represents the Haudenosaunee and their canoe. The other purple row represents the Dutch and the ship. And then the three white rows in between were significant teachings and agreements that they would come to live through this journey together in parallel lines, never interfering. So within one vessel of the Haudenosaunee, we have all of the traditional teachings, ways of being, spirituality, languages, knowledge, and the same for the Dutch. They would have their ways of being, their forms of knowledge, their religions, language. And the idea was that they would travel down these parallel paths, never interfering. so that both could find and thrive successfully on the journey of life. What was so impactful for myself was, as an Indigenous woman, but also I also have another portion to my ancestry on my father's side of British settlers. His parents immigrated here prior to his birth. And one of the teachings that Rick was talking about was the difficulty that people would have living with one foot in both vessels. And how would they do that? Because when you try to have, if you've ever been in any form of water vehicles, one foot in separate ones, it doesn't work out very well. And so I had internalized that, how am I going to find my way in navigating this world with these two very different ways of being, but in one space for this human experience that I'm having? So moving through the world as an Anishinaabe woman, a mother, an educator, a politician, I'm constantly trying to find this balance, but also while having one foot in each vessel. And some days I'm really successful. Some days I'm upside down in the water. Everything I do is rooted in these founding principles. What can I do in this moment to move peacefully things forward, whether it's a conversation, whether it's a professional development session, whether it's a meeting, whether it's just a relationship with another person? How can I continue to build relationships in a good way, or support them with the respect at the forefront at all times? So one of those teachings within one of those white rows is peace. So how am I going to move through this world in a peaceful way? How am I going to monitor my actions so that I am moving in a nonviolent, but creating peace even when things are most challenging? That's constantly something that I'm navigating at all times, especially in difficult conversations, difficult rooms that I sit within. How do I maintain that peaceful disposition and creating peace for the area in which I am taking up? How am I continuing to build relationships? Friendship was the second of the white rose. How am I continuing to build friendship between these communities that I'm working with at any given time? And how am I continuing to do all of this with respect? So those were three of the principles within that wampum belt that those two First Nations, not two First Nations, but those two nations that first came together to create an agreement to work with one another, to coexist, and to support each other in ways that they could without interference. Those were the very first beginnings of how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people began to work in treaty with one another long before we came. But you can imagine if we had maintained those intentions from the very beginning of non-interference, peace, friendship, and respect, what a different place we would be today navigating this human experience. One of the other most important sets of teachings that I received in learning to live in this particular area was living within the Dish with One Spoon territory. And that's a great span of land in the southwestern Ontario. And this particular belt and set of teaching was part of the original instructions for the Haudenosaunee. And later, it would come to be an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee. And much of southwestern Ontario, there's a long, complicated history of back and forth. But at one point, they did come together to talk about how can we share this space? How can we do this in a good way so that, again, it's that ability to allow others to success and thrive while still maintaining our independence and individuality. One of the greatest teachings that I've taken from, one of the greatest principles from this particular belt is to only take what you need. So when we're thinking about resources and sharing land, being incredibly conscious of only ever taking what we need. So if we're out, and even during this pandemic, we've seen some of the panic shopping that's happening. This came into play incredibly, only taking what our particular household would need. As much as the panic was there to get all the toilet paper and not being able to find it at times, but making sure that there was always enough for the next person. And that's one of the next key principles that I take from this belt, that I walk through the world with every day, is whatever I take in that moment, it is my responsibility to make sure there is some there for the next person to come. And that could mean the next generation when we're talking on a larger scale of natural resources. This could be simply at a family meal, making sure that there is enough for the next person, but always thinking generations down the line from an Indigenous perspective. Then thirdly, one of the main principles that I take from this particular belt's teachings is about always keeping the dish clean. And the belts are always metaphorical. And the dish in this case is with reference to the land. So whatever I'm taking from the land, whatever I'm doing in partnership with the next person or in preparation for the generations to come, it's my responsibility to always make sure that the dish is clean. So whether that's my property, whether that's in my advocacy for water or land protection, part of being as an Anishinaabe, I mentioned that as being a water protector. And so I have those core responsibilities, those original instructions that came down for us from the creator, that come with our clan, that come with our assigned roles, and sometimes even with our names. If we have traditional names or spirit names that come forward, there's responsibilities that fall within there. So these two particular belts really guide a lot of what I do every day, whether it's in a school board, whether it's in a union office, whether it's in a professional development session or a discussion or a meeting like we're having this evening. All of these teachings come into play, hopefully guiding me to do the work that I do always in a good way. And when I use the term a good way, it's not our opposing ideas of good and bad. When we talk about things being done in a good way, it's referencing in alignment with our teachings and with the best of intentions and with our whole heart and gratitude coming through to that. So you'll hear me reference in a good way, and that's what I'm talking about. It's not just me being a good girl or following the rules. It's talking about following our teachings and doing things with a good heart and with the best of intentions. A lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight, and you're going to be hearing me, is how I navigate the world with this particular word that you're seeing on the screen, Adawaptima. And this is a Mi'kmaq word, and it references two-eyed seeing. And there's an incredible TED Talk by Rebecca Thomas, who is a Mi'kmaq woman, incredible poet. And she has this beautiful TED Talk that continues to inspire me in everything that I do. Whenever I need a reminder of why I am doing the work that I'm doing in whichever avenue, why I continue to advocate for Indigenous families, Indigenous education, Indigenous students, and building relationships within the spirit of reconciliation with our community partners and our neighbors. I often will go back and listen to her TED Talk because it explains everything so beautifully. So if you get a chance, you can Google Rebecca Thomas TED Talk, and you can have a listen to it later. It's one of the few TED Talks that actually are out there that speak to my heart, and absolutely lovely to explain exactly what we're going to talk about, navigating the two worlds with both lenses. And the term two-eyed seeing, Adawaptima, comes from an elder, Albert Marshall. And it was originally introduced to support the STEM, the work being done in STEM, and incorporating an Indigenous knowledge lens. Because what happens is, for Indigenous people, we are constantly navigating this world through both lenses. And I imagine it happens for many people who are coming with intersectional identities. And that could be with respect to ethnicity, gender, self-identification in a number of different areas. It's how you see the world through multiple lenses. And when we're looking at indigeneity really is a lived experience. And so for myself, when I'm navigating the world, whether it's as a labor activist, I'm always keeping in mind all of those people that came before me and the responsibility that comes with me using my voice. Also my incredible privilege that I have to do the work that all those that came before me didn't have the opportunity to do, weighs heavily. But it also is so important that I continue to move through this world with the lens of Adawaptama for all those generations to come, and in supporting of those students, the children that are there, because they really are going to be the change makers of the future. And it's really important to be doing that work that I'm able to now, to be able to ensure that they have the opportunities to carry on their indigeneity as they begin to navigate the world. And my niece sent me this piece of artwork, and I happen to be a huge fan of Wonder Woman. And my whole family knows that I struggle with, how do I live with these multiple lenses? How do I navigate the world advocating for unionism in a labor world? But how do I do that with an Indigenous lens? How do I navigate education? And so she sent me this, that this artist had incorporated a fancy shawl dancer with Wonder Woman. And I think it incorporates everything that I continue to try and do perfectly in one piece of art. So when we're talking about Indigenous women, and there is an incredible variety of experiences that you would encounter with every woman that you would ask. Their story is going to be similar in themes, but our experiences very different. And I want to just touch on some of that. And you might notice in the second picture that just floated up there, just ignore Joe. He sneaks into all of our spaces, but he's an incredible support for all of us. But I love this picture of some of the women that I've had the pleasure of working with and walking alongside, and really teaching me about their experience as Indigenous women navigating the world. There's also a non-Indigenous colleague there, an ally who does some amazing work with students as well. But I wanted to touch on how unique our teachings are to each of our nations. And even in this particular group of women, many of them are Haudenosaunee, but their teachings are all going to be different depending on where they are in their journey. And myself, I'm Anishinaabe. There's another woman there that's Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and another woman who's Haudenosaunee and American. And so our experiences and the way we navigate the world are so very different, also based on our roles and responsibilities within those communities. I spoke briefly about my role as a Martin and as a water protector. I take those particular roles and responsibilities really seriously. When I was working in this particular school board that I was in at the time, it was really hard for the people that I was working with to understand and acknowledge that my offices that I was navigating, so I had 3 different offices when I was working on 6 Nations, and 2 out of those 3 did not have running water. Here I am working for a public publicly funded school board. My office on reserve, 2 out of 3 of those offices did not have drinkable water. Though they did have running water, so we could wash and clean and do the things that we needed to do within the building, but the water was not drinkable. I was literally about 100 feet from a main highway where on the other side of the street, completely drinkable water. How is that possible? And so at the time, it consumed a lot of the work I was doing at that time in water advocacy, in particular with Nestle. And in particular with Nestle, because Nestle had a permit to take water from the ground within the Haldimand Tract, which is still under Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. And what I struggled so much with at the time was the fact that they were allowed to take the water from the ground at pennies. And then because the people within the same treaty territory didn't have drinkable water, they had to buy that water back, because whose water was always cheapest? Nestle. It was $1.88 for 24. And there was nothing that would incense me so much. And then to go into different office spaces and see Nestle candy. And there was a period of time where much of the work that I was doing completely was around advocating awareness for the use of Nestle products and Nestle water within the spaces that I was entering. And much of my family had to adjust, my friends. So when I would go to their houses, in particular my mom, just being conscious of not having Nestle products or buying Nestle water, let alone not offering me any Nestle water, because it would be a very long conversation. And one funny story, that person I was dating at the time went in to grab some sparkling water to go to something we were going to, and brought out a case of Nestle sparkling water cans. And oh my goodness, but he did have flowers with him as well, but he did have to go back into the store to return the water because it did not go over well. And he was well aware of issues with the Nestle water. But that's where being in spaces where my roles and responsibilities as an Indigenous woman and as an Anishinaabe in the responsibility to the water that I had, that would then end up in spaces, but I had to do it in a good way so that it would be heard and listened and attended to. And more often than not, as soon as people became aware of the issue, they too, what's happening? They would be incensed, and let's do what we can. And it just became very apparent and engageable with other people to share in those issues and concerns that I was having as an Indigenous person working in those spaces. One of the other pieces that living as an Indigenous woman are many of our teachings around being women, and specifically our moontime teachings. They are in stark contrast to the Eurocentric ideas of menstruation. So in many nations, when we're talking about menstruation from an Indigenous perspective, it's called moontime. And it's because of the incredible connection to Grandmother Moon and our ties to the moon cycles. But the one thing that as a mother that I really struggled with was when you're raising a daughter. And for anyone out there, mothers or aunties, when you're talking about raising women up into the society where we are, there's an incredible amount of challenges that are there, but teaching a woman, a growing woman, about her body and the Eurocentric shame that comes with menstruation that has been historical, but ensuring that I was passing on those important teachings about the power that comes with that menstruation cycle and the cleansing, and being conscious of that 28-day cycle, that with every cycle there comes a cleansing and a rebirth and a renew. and how powerful we were within that time, and that there wasn't a shame. It wasn't something that we had to hide. Whereas in the past, I know for many within my generation, you didn't talk about that. You didn't, you get the paper brown bag when you picked up your box of pads way back when I first got it, and you just didn't talk about it. Whereas I really wanted to change that for my daughter, to embrace her womanhood and to have pride in those changes that were happening to her. And I really wanted to make sure that those teachings around the body would be with that Indigenous lens as well. It was really important that when I was teaching my daughter about her own indigeneity and about our own teachings, it was also really important to unlearn, reevaluate, and reassess what we had come to learn, even ourselves as Indigenous women, those stereotypes of what an Indigenous woman should look like. And I often will surprise people when I show up and sit down, and people were expecting this Indigenous woman to come forward. And it becomes a stark realization of predetermined stereotypes that we have of what an Indigenous woman appears like. And it wasn't until I went to this particular conference for work, and it was the first time I had been in a space of Indigenous women that none of us looked alike. No one looked like anyone other. And we all had very different stories. We all had such different experiences and teachings. And it was a space where we came together and shared those. But then not only just shared our experiences in the positive, but also were able to let go of those feelings of not being Indigenous enough because we don't look like the stereotype. And it's so important that even in our communities here of women, that we are consciously aware of who do we expect to show up when we hear there's an Indigenous woman coming like this evening. Who were you presupposing that was going to be on screen? I know for me, coming into this space here, that very first time, I was taken aback by my own misunderstandings, but it also helped me to heal that little part of myself that many urban Indigenous women experience, is that scale of how Indigenous am I? And that stems from a lot of the colonial ideas of who has status, who fits within which level of blood quantum within your community, that you get a card, you don't get a card, which are you 6-1A, all of these different delineations that come down from the government over history have changed who we see as just as our lived experience as Indigenous. And so one of those pieces navigating through the world, and especially working with other women, is helping Indigenous women to see that same light of there is no stereotype that you have to fit into. There is no number of teachings that you have to acquire to be considered Indigenous. It's your lived experience and how you navigate the world. And that was really important for me to bring as many Indigenous women and incredibly strong voiced women as allies surrounding my daughter in her growing up, so that she would feel that power, that strength, but also see the allyship and the multifaceted skills that come from a wide circle of women that would be supporting her growing into womanhood. So this is my daughter. This represents our journey through teenagehood, I think, very well. My daughter is a competitive dancer, and this was a real challenge for myself in allowing her, developing her journey into personhood. And while she's a competitive dancer in just about every discipline, ballet, jazz, hip hop, tap, contemporary, lyrical, she has yet to move into traditional dance style of Anishinaabe or powwow. And it's a real struggle for me as an Indigenous woman trying to carry our traditions forward, that she didn't make those choices. And I think, you know, many parents and communities have these same challenges. But it's also about me also not imposing a colonial view for her that this is what you must do because this is who we are told we are. I have always come from a much more open stance that I wouldn't force an identity onto either of my children. And it became very apparent when she was young that wasn't going to happen anyway. She was a mini me from the very beginning. And this wasn't Batgirl, it was Batman. She was going to be the next Batman. But what I appreciated in her was her strength and her will, and her tenacity, which have always served her well, but it's always about finding that balance between those two worlds, ensuring that she still has the opportunities to develop in her identity, to be exposed to community, having those teachings, hearing the music, hearing the drums, seeing the ceremonies, and engaging with elders and community, having those opportunities, but still being able to find her place in this ever-changing and, in her world, urban experience. So as an Indigenous woman and mother, it's really challenging to nurture all of those pieces so that she can develop into this strong, independent woman who's going to navigate this world and hopefully carry on some of that work after I'm gone. And it's really important that I allow that space for that to occur. I know I was forced to go to Sunday school when I was little because my neighbors did. So my parents thought, well, we should be sending them as well. And it was very confusing. I grew up in an urban setting, so I didn't have the opportunity of ceremony and all of the gifts that my cousins did have. So having those parallel worlds again was very challenging, but I appreciated it because then as I grew, I could make my own choices. And when I talk about my children, these are them. And I really hope they don't come by and see anything that I used a Christmas morning picture from a couple of years ago. So they both have bed heads. They're going to kill me. But I love the fact that they have these sweaters because this is always my ultimate goal, is how do I create space for them to navigate in a world where they can be proud to be who they are, so that they can stand strong and walk tall in a world that, if you're paying attention to social media or some news outlets, it's not always positive. And my ultimate goal is always finding that balance for them and creating Mino B'Madzuin, which is good life in Ojibwe. And that's, when we talk about doing things in a good way, that's what it's referring to, the good life. And it's walking in a good way through the world. And so how do I do that with history, a collective history where our languages have been stripped, and that connections to community, connections to ceremony were intentionally taken? And how do I create opportunities for those cultural ways of being to come back into their life, but not in a forceful way, so that they rebel and go off and do the things that some of us very well have done? How do I introduce and accept and allow them to explore different methods of religion, spirituality, while incorporating their own ways of knowing and being? They always had questions about God and Christianity, Judaism. There was a period in my own life that I was living a Buddhist understanding and developing through those teachings. And so just really exploring the world and all that's there, giving them the space to come to their own understandings. while also navigating outside influences. And this is a very universal parenting challenge. How do we navigate those outside influences when we're trying to create space for good humans to live with us and share space with us in our homes as our children? Can be really challenging, especially when you are trying to preserve, as an Indigenous person, all of those pieces that have already been taken away, and some of the challenges with language, the racism that is there, the threat of becoming a statistic in so many different ways. Indigenous people in Canada are one of the groups that have been most studied. The most data collected about are Indigenous people, and it's not always positive. And so I'm constantly challenged as an Indigenous mother, Indigenous woman, and how am I protecting my children from becoming a statistic, whether it be a positive or a negative. Navigating racism, there's a whole evening on that particular topic, and there's no easy or simple way to help them navigate that world of racism, except alongside them. And there's nothing more heartbreaking than the first time you have to have those conversations with them. And for my daughter, it was in grade 6. And it was the first year she had ever self-identified at school. And the teacher turned her inside out that year. There was a new administrator halfway through as well. And I had to go to, and it was within the board that I was working in. And the following year, I had to go to a parent council meeting. They wanted some professional development, explore some opportunities that could be brought into the school. And it was one of the most challenging evenings of my professional career. It was probably the only meeting that I have ever left and actually cried after, because I was treated so horribly by the administrator at the time. And because I was a professional there within the school board in that role, I wasn't there as a parent that night. I had to maintain that level of professionalism. And it's probably the only time since then that I've ever ate it. And I went home and my daughter asked, oh, how was it? How did it go? And I was honest with her. It was awful. It went okay. Professionally, it went well, but inside, as an Indigenous woman, it was heart-wrenching. And my daughter asked me, for the first time she's ever questioned this, she said, do you think it is you that she doesn't like, in reference to the administrator, or Mom, do you think it's all of us? And I didn't have an answer. And it was the first time we ever had to have that conversation. And it became, an ongoing conversation as we faced challenges that year. But I continued to show up for her, continued to advocate for her. We ended up having to go through some counseling to get through the end of the year, and that teacher ended up retiring. And I did take other actions behind the scenes with my own boss, and letting her know about the challenges of that particular meeting, and it was dealt with. I just had to go through the proper channels to do so, which isn't very easy in the moment. But sometimes in navigating those spaces, knowing the process you have to go through is the only way that change can come, because we don't always have, as Indigenous people, we don't always have the same latitude that is given for being emotional, for being angry, for reacting in the moment, because there's stereotypes that come with that. And if there's anything that I'm ever intentional about is what can I do to break down some of those stereotypes? How can I create a relationship so that I can always engage in those conversations with someone to change how this can move forward? So there's many differences in raising a daughter and raising a son, and especially with respect to men's teachings. And my children are 10 years apart, almost to the day, and they have always had the spirit of this relationship right here all the way through. And it's always been really challenging as a mom, as an Indigenous mom. His father is non-Indigenous, so he doesn't always have those teachings. So how do I create the opportunities for him to understand traditional teachings of connections to the land, connection to women, empowering him in his journey, but also creating the consciousness of the Eurocentric views that are being put upon him of what a man is to be, which it can be very, very different than in Indigenous teachings. Being conscious of alcohol and the trappings of it, the stereotypes attached to it because of who he is as an Indigenous person, the poison and the history that comes with it that's been brought to Indigenous communities. And I think that was really challenging for him to see, because it's such a part of way of life that to have that consciousness of having alcohol and what that means when we walk in the world that we do. And also creating that consciousness of relationship to authority figures, and specifically with the police, without creating fear, leading with respect, but caution, finding that balance, that manobamadzuin within those challenging relationships that are pre-existent before us and will be there after us, hopefully lessened so by the work that we do. But how do I create those awarenesses without fear, and how to lead in a good way with respect to teachings around the land, with the Mother Earth being female. And part of men's responsibilities within our communities are to protect the land, women and children. Those are some of their prime responsibilities. And how do I instill that into him? And here he is, he's braiding his sister's hair. And this particular picture is one of my favorites, because all that goes into the teachings of our hair. And here he is braiding his younger sister's hair. And they always have had this incredible relationship. And anyone on social media that has followed me, a lot of the comments I get is, you guys look like you're always having so much fun. And there's always a caretaker relationship between the two of them. And it's something that has been very intentional, and I'm incredibly grateful that they hold on to it as long as they do, because it's an incredibly unique relationship that they have, but it's one built of reciprocity, how they are to work in tandem with one another based on their teachings. When we're talking about relationship of men to the land and to women, when we look at what's happening with the stripping of natural resources from the earth, we can directly see those ties to how some of the male supremacy is tied to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. When we're looking at those relationships to the land, the greed that comes from, and then when we look at the issues that are there of why that this violence, this gender-based violence is there. You can read more about that in the Reclaiming Power and Place final report for the National Inquiry to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. But so much of that is tied to the land and the greed and the over extraction of resources there as well. That broken relationship with Mother Earth, and the broken teachings, and so much of that is tied together. And again, that's a whole other evening of learning, but being conscious of when we see the land protectors come forward, it's not because of this negative relationship that they're trying to establish. It's their roles and responsibilities to Mother Earth, to the land. Those are our original instructions from the Creator, that is what they're to do. They're there to protect the land for the generations to come. That's their roles and responsibilities. Similar to me being a warrior as a Martin, that's part of it. Being an advocate, being an activist, protecting what we have, just like within that belt, taking only what we need, ensuring that there is some there for the next generation. So after getting a little heavy there, people always ask me about what it's like to be an Indigenous politician. And it really depends on the day of the response. But in general, being a politician in a Eurocentric sense is not our way. And in many senses, it's not looked upon well. We can be seen as sellouts, giving up our identities. It's really hard to reconcile being an Indigenous person, an Indigenous woman, taking on some of those roles. And when I went into politics, it wasn't because I had ever dreamed. I had no aspirations of being in politics, but I had been working in partnership with so many women's groups and developing my voice and advocacy. And in particular, when the conservative government that was most recent, that is in power now, when it came into power in 2018, some of their very first changes were with respect to the Indigenous communities. Indigenous education, dollars were retracted. They changed the portfolios for Indigenous relations and Indigenous affairs. They canceled the Indigenous education curriculum writing sessions that were going on that were very much needed. And it was all within the first 90 days of them coming into power. And I was livid. This was work that I was so deeply invested in doing and supporting educators across the province within the board I was working within to create change in their classrooms, develop their own capacity. And it was being swept away in one quick failed swoop, just whoom, gone. And I didn't know what else to do. I mailed my MP, called the MPP. It was so infuriating. But I had this voice and I have this visual white privileged face that shows up into rooms that people were listening to. And the incredible knowledge that I was gathering and support that I put my name forward. And it was for the federal election, actually. And it was a terrifying, terrifying moment, but I was done with having people make decisions for me any longer and not being representative of who I was, my concerns, not understanding the communities I was working in with respect to housing, with respect to water, with respect to network, the bands of network for wireless connections. One of the first things that happened during the pandemic for students on Six Nations of the Grand River and Mississaugas and territories all over Ontario was, how are they going to connect to online learning? The poorest of poor, including rural Ontario as well. How are we going to connect when that bandwidth hasn't been attended to? And that was one of the issues on our platform as well at the time. And I was just done. I was done sitting by and waiting and watching. And I had to do something. And someone asked me on the right day, "What would you ever consider running?" And at first I laughed it off. And then I talked to some of my other Indigenous women colleagues that I was working with, and what do you guys think? How will, and I had to really have those conversations. How will you see me? Will I lose respect in the community for all the work I've done? As I said, we can be seen as sellouts. And I didn't want to lose the momentum of the work that was happening. Then I remember there was this incredible human who was navigating the non-Indigenous world to improve the conditions for Indigenous children. And I couldn't deny the change that she was creating in her leadership. When I had the chance to meet her and speak with her about a number of different things, I've always had a million questions, and I could not risk not using my voice or taking on a platform. And I think if there was anything that I was most proud of coming out of that particular run, was bringing the awareness to water in our community and the lack thereof of drinkable potable water in such an urban centered location. And talking about Indigenous issues, but also just really being a different voice and a different perspective in each of those debates, interviews, just having very different conversations and meaningful ones. My responsibility as a Martin Clan person is to be a strategist and to be a warrior. And that was always at the forefront to do so. If anything, I'm gonna share what the work we're doing. I'm gonna talk about the water in this area and the inequities that exist. And that was really important for me. And I don't know what I would have done if I was actually elected. But I was heard, and it was my responsibility to do that as an Anishinaabe woman and as a Martin warrior. And I come from a long line of them. My granny and my grandpa Ben both were warriors in their different ways, but they constantly remind me as well that every choice that I make today impacts generations to come, just as they did. So my grandpa Ben fought in Grandpa Ben Senior. We have a lot of Ben Sawyers in our family. So he is Grandpa Ben Sawyer Senior, fought in Korea. And because he served his country and he made that choice, and he did so in a confident and proud way. However, making that choice impacts all the generations that came after him, because when he returned from the war, he was forced to enfranchise, which means give up his Indigenous identity. And because of that choice, because of his service to Canada in that war, it impacts my children's generation and my nieces and nephews, their ability to access status, which impacts their identity as Indigenous people in Canada. And it's quite complicated, and I won't go into it all. But that's why the weight of some of the decisions that I make are so important, because of the implications that it does have for all of those generations to come. But because the two of them served in the ways that they did, it also empowers me that I have a responsibility and a privilege to use my voice to advocate, to be an activist on those things that others either didn't have a voice to do or don't have the voice to do at this time. And so as a unionist, I really believe in the collective power, and that collectivist understanding comes from that Indigenous perspective as well, that we're stronger together. There's teachings with respect to bundled arrows, that if you have one arrow, it's very easy to break, but when you have multiple, you can't. And so I take those teachings with me in my unionism and my activism. And when I'm working with women in mentorship and leadership opportunities, sharing that with them, also reversing some of those laterally violent tendencies that women in today's society have with one another, this competition, and instead creating this collective unity and the power that comes from the female engagement is incredible. And so changing that around and creating that collectivist unity is really important to me, and moving through the world as an educator and in creating leadership opportunities. And where all of this really began for me was a few years ago. I went to a random conference. I was in the classroom still, but there was an Indigenous Education Conference in Brampton, and I went and I took part in this particular workshop, Project of Heart. And you take a little wood tile, you do some, I think it's called decoupage. I don't know. You put sticky stuff on, design. I don't have any art DNA. I apologize to all the artists in the room. But I was attempting to engage in that creative process. And I took this particular set of words from some papers that were on the table, not knowing how impactful this particular bullet would be. And it's from the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, numbers 62, 63, 64. And it says, educate teachers how to integrate Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into classrooms. And then on the other side, there's a picture of students that were within that TRC package as an image. And I had put that on the other side, and I had created it as a pendant. And I carried it for a long time. And that was before I even went into an Indigenous lead role, before I really started becoming an activist within Indigenous education, not knowing that that particular activity, that particular day would then change the trajectory of the work that I would begin to do. And in the basis of that, I committed myself that I was going to create relationships, create awareness, work with educators to create cultural safety within their classrooms, within their workspaces, so that students could have a different type of experience. They would have a different learning opportunity and a building of relationships that wasn't there before. That they would have representation, that students would have the opportunity to see an Indigenous educator at the front of their classroom, leading leadership opportunities, creating groups and clubs that represent activities that allow them to bring their whole identity to the classroom or to the school, and see their families represented on family nights, and supporting other educators in general with changing how, I don't want to say changing, but improving how they bring the Indigenous perspective to the classroom, or starting to do it for the first time in a safe and encouraged, supported way, with wonderful resources and people there to support them through the process of developing cultural humility, which some of this language is new: cultural humility, cultural safety. And it's really changing how our Indigenous students are navigating their experience in school, and how Indigenous staff are working within the school, feeling safe to bring their identity, to be who they are, to not hide behind their classroom doors, but to be truly a part of a community within education, and really change how our communities are interacting with one another and creating communities outside of powwows or specific events such as that, where maybe those interactions only happened there. I think the biggest challenge for me as an Indigenous woman is navigating social media. My mantra is always don't read the comments, especially given any day where there is an Indigenous issue in the news. Don't read the comments. I tell myself that. I don't always listen to it. It's probably my biggest failing is I will read the comments, and I'm reminded how much work there is still need to be done within our relationships in Canada. However, I'm also encouraged sometimes when I do go to the comments and there's incredible allies and neighbors that are there saying incredible things, and it is changing, and that does happen, and it's beautiful, and it makes me grateful that I went to the comments. But it can be very challenging for family members when they go to the comments. I know when my daughter first got social media, that was my biggest concern, but supporting them in how to navigate those conversations, how to hold on to their space, be conservative about who you engage with and how to do that. So I'm constantly, as an adult, reevaluating who I allow on my pages, that I see their information, and who can see mine. And it's really about picking my battles. And this is in physical spaces that I engage in as well. Sometimes there needs to be a voice, and I'm going to be that voice, and I'm going to take up that space. Sometimes I need to lead by example. Sometimes I'm the person in the room that is the only one with the confidence to say what needs to be said at the time. And oftentimes when I go into a room with other people of color or racialized or marginalized groups, we will often have those conversations going in, pre-planning who's going to speak to which issue, so that no one person ever takes up that amount of space, but also finding out if others don't have the voice to do so, so that I can lead by example, and I can set the tone, or I can set the space for someone else to then engage. Sometimes
Sabrina?
it's really, yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. This is Sarah. So we have so many questions and lots of excited people. So I wanted to respect your time. I don't know how much time you have to give us, but just to let you know, I hope we have ability to reserve time for a few questions at the end.
Absolutely. I think we only have maybe one more slide after this, and then we're going to questions.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks for the check-in. Sometimes the truth needs to be shared, and there's space to do that. And it's important when that opportunity arrives, even as an ally, to make sure that you take up that space. If there isn't someone there speaking to it, to ensure that if there is something that you're confident about sharing, to do so, because someone else may be in the room that looks like me, that someone doesn't expect to be Indigenous, that if an ally does take up that space and say, hey, what's being said, what's happening isn't okay, that person may then feel comfortable because they have another person in the room to then step in and engage in that work that needs to happen. However, sometimes I have to assess, can I make a difference in this moment? Probably not. If it's at a point where I don't feel like I can engage and that person is actually going to hear me or engage in a dialogue, sometimes I just will let it go. Because it just may cost me too much emotional labor without any return. And we just have to assess those spaces. Is the person there able to listen and truly hear what's going on, so that I can assess, is it worth my energy and happiness to engage in this conversation? And we all have those family dinners. There's just one person where you just have to let them go. And then you change the topic, or you talk to the person on the left, because, you know, Uncle Bill is who he is, and we just got to ride that out. You know, if there's a new person that joins the table and maybe has some ability to have conversation and maybe says something that's out of line, you can engage in that conversation in a good way and that you think will be fruitful. Those are the conversations that I look for. I don't always look for the adversarial ones, because it costs me too much energy and emotional labor that someone just may not be able to move out of that. And it brings us right back to where we started, navigating that world through the lens of Atawaptamuk, based on those original teachings of the two-row, how to navigate having one foot in either vessel, while incorporating all those original teachings and intentions while traveling down the pathway of life together so that everyone finds their journey and are able to find success and to thrive in whatever way meets their needs. So I think we're right at 8:15. And yeah, I have lots of time for questions. However you want to navigate that.
Perfect. Sabrina, I will turn it over to Elaine, who has been, I believe, collecting. Otherwise, Elaine, if you'd like, we can read them. But I do, on behalf of FWIO, I want to say thank you so much, Sabrina. And this has been like so rewarding for so many of us, I think, to listen to it. Me as a mom and me as someone working for this organization, we all do come to this information from different places, and we have different fears and anxieties and enthusiasms and passions. And so it's wonderful that you took time for all of us wherever we are tonight. And so we do have a few questions. And Elaine, are you ready to read them, or would you like Kate or I to read them?
Actually, you and Kate can go right ahead. That's just fine. And I'll chime in if I need to. Thanks.
Okay. Kate, I'm going to let you unmute if you like. I'm going to catch up for a second but one of the questions, I think, let me just scroll through. I think one of the questions, so I think we'll start here. So one question, and this may be a tricky one. Oh, here's a great one. Nancy, will you run again for political office? You would be great. Question one.
I get that question all the time. I do not foresee politics being out of reach. At the time that I ran, I was running, my mother passed away during my campaign. I was moving into a new home. I was also running for a provincial election within the union that I was working at. And so it was an incredible year of change and turmoil. And so the last couple of years with the pandemic, I've been afforded an incredible amount of time with my two children, who are very quickly leaving me as adults, I'm sure of it. And so my son being 26 now and my daughter 16, I only have a couple more years with them before they leave. So I think once they leave the nest, I will probably explore that a little bit more fulsome, but I've been enjoying the downtime these last couple of years while I have with them. But I never say never, because just when I think I know what's going to happen, the world lets me know and the universe lets me know that I have no idea what's about to step up. So I just always say never say never.
Perfect. Another one, a little bit of a challenging one. So what are your thoughts as a politician? This comes from a different Nancy, actually, as a politician and activist on the Douglas Creek and 14892 land back lane situations in Caledonia, Ontario.
That's a really big question. And it's, again, so someone's asking me as a politician and an activist. For that particular one, it's challenging because it's a Haudenosaunee issue, primarily, where those challenges lie within the treaties that are being discussed and challenged. It does fall within the Between the Lakes treaty area at the time, but I think what's mostly being challenged is within the Haldimand Tract and those particular areas, which it's very, the treaty lands and the history of it are very complicated. And so as an Anishinaabe woman, it's not always my place to speak on behalf of the Haudenosaunee. And that's just out of respect. As a politician, I think, or I believe, I should say, I believe that it's really time for the federal government to engage in these hard conversations. There's a lot of land challenges that need to be addressed, and they need to step up and start having those conversations. It's 2022. And it's not a secret anymore. And I really think they need to take responsibility and start to address some of the challenges that are coming forward so that we can begin to look to find resolution within these conflicts. And it's hard for me to speak on because of where I live, where I work, and the communities that I live within. And I support the land protectors in their roles and responsibilities of doing what they need to do. But I also pay attention to what the clan mothers are asking at the time. And that's really important to look at. The clan mothers within the Haudenosaunee communities direct the work that needs to be done within their community. So personally, I haven't heard as of late what the clan mothers' directions have been. So that's what I would have to respect and acknowledge wherever they are from the Haudenosaunee perspective. So it's really challenging. And if you want to understand a lot of that work from the Haudenosaunee perspective, Phil Montour has done an incredible history on the Haldeman Tract and all of the treaties and the land surrenders and all of the pieces that go to it. Phil Montour has done an incredible job. So if you're looking to do any research into that, I would definitely direct you to do that in his regard.
Thank you. Excellent. Phil Montour. I think that's a really good advice to learn more about that. And then many of our members are asking to see a copy of your presentation. So I will say that we have recorded this, so everyone will be able to review it online again. But are you willing to share your slides?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, and then let me just scan quickly. I think that is it. Let me see, I hear there was a couple interesting comments. Yes, so here's one. Noreen says, you stated that enfranchisement occurred in your family line due to family members joining the service, and how it's impacted First Nation status for your children. I believe Indian Affairs is relooking at these cases, and you might have a chance to relook into this. I work in First Nation status and Métis citizenship cases, so just a thought for you. So she's passing that along.
Thank you. And it is challenging. I mean, and there's different ways that the courts have made allowances with the double mother rule, and there's a lot of work that's been done, but in particular with his particular case, because he enfranchised and then passed away before looking to have it reinstated, it creates a barrier right now. So yes, so legally I am going to have to look into that. But status was something, again, I was leaving open to my children to, it's a very political decision whether or not they want to engage in having status or not having status. So I had left that till they had come to an age of majority to make those decisions for themselves, instead of me putting on who they were going to be with their identities.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it over to Elaine and to you to say goodnight, but I want to say how many comments there are in all the various chat mediums saying what a fabulous presentation. So again, we thank you from all of us, and I will turn it over to Elaine.
Thank you. Sabrina, just there was one thing we overlooked in the questions, and I think it's a fairly quick answer. What is wampum? We know the wampum belt that you showed us and the significance of the decorations or the weaving on the various belts. How would we translate wampum to understand properly what the purpose of wampum belts were in the first place?
So wampum belts are the earliest, some of the earliest treaties that were recorded, and they did so over these particular belts that were made of quahog shells and two different types of shells. And so it's understood that those shells would carry that energy and carry those words and the spirit of those agreements. And the faith keepers that held those belts would then recite those agreements regularly and share them with the communities that were involved, the nations that were involved in those agreements. And so it was one of the first ways that the Haudenosaunee in particular began to record those treaties. They were no longer just oral agreements, but it was a record. And so there's wampum belts. This particular one, the Geswentha, dates back to the early 1600s. So some will say 1613, various dates around that time, but that's what they were. They were our earliest forms of agreements and treaties between nations when coming to learn how to work together, live together, and share resources.
Perfect, thank you. I feel like for me, the visual representation of the wampum belt, the stripes side by side, not interfering with each other, is because I'm a visual thinker, that's a great takeaway for our conversation tonight. So thank you. Thank you for the whole evening, for sharing everything that you have shared. And as you mentioned along the way, there are several more evenings that we could spend together just to learn more, because we all have an awful lot to learn. Thank you ever so much.
Oh, miigwech to everyone who shared their time with us tonight. And thank you for all your questions. And I wish I could get to all the comments, but it is so full. And thank you for sharing space with me this evening to hear my story.
That's wonderful.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you everyone who attended. And we will be passing along the recording of tonight's meeting, as Sarah mentioned. It will be in the e-blast next week. It will be on the website and also on Facebook. So you'll have no trouble retrieving that. If by chance you can't find it, just reach out to Sarah at the office and she will direct you to it. If you're here tonight and you're not yet a member of WI, you're welcome to email fwio@fwio.on.ca or pop onto our website, fwio.on.ca, for more information. We welcome your interest and we're happy to answer your questions. We will be sending everyone who attended a very brief survey, just 3 or 4 questions, and ask you to please, if you don't mind, taking about 1 minute to answer and submit that. Huge thank you to Sarah and Kate from the FWIO office for their work in promoting tonight's event and in taking care of all the background work in running it. Thank you both.
It's our
Have
pleasure.
a good evening, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thank you again.